Intro. There are some stories you hear once, and then spend the rest of your life trying to forget. But this one, you won't be able to. In the quiet suburbs of Ohio, in the winter of 2019, a family moved into what they thought was their dream home. Fresh paint, warm light spilling from the windows at night, the faint smell of cedar in the attic. It was perfect, or so they thought, because something else was already living there, not in the basement, not in a locked room, above them, just a few feet over their heads, separated only by plaster and wooden beams. Something had been watching them, listening to them, moving when they slept, breathing when they didn't notice, and it had been doing so for months. This isn't a local legend whispered about at high school parties. This isn't a ghost story you tell around a campfire. It's real, documented in official police reports, confirmed in sworn neighbor testimonies, captured in photographs the public was never meant to see. I have those details. I have those accounts. And tonight, you will too. But I should warn you. Once you know the truth, once you've heard everything that family went through, you'll never look at your ceiling the same way again. You'll start to wonder, what's really up there? Is it empty? Or has it been empty at all? You are listening to Screams of the Mind, the darkest corner where fears are given a voice. I bring you stories that claw their way into your thoughts and stay there. Stories that don't fade when you turn off the lights. Stories that linger, pacing in the shadows, waiting for you to close your eyes. Subscribe now, because every night there is something new to fear, and tonight's fear might just be living above you. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The First Sound. Before the first sound, there was nothing unusual about Greg and Laura Peters. They were the kind of couple you'd meet at a Sunday yard sale or see smiling at the farmer's market. Greg, in his late 30s, had a quiet, dependable air, a man who could spend an entire Saturday in the garage, tinkering with power tools, perfecting something no one else would even notice. Laura, 2 years younger, was the warmth in the house, always baking, always filling the air with the smell of cinnamon rolls, sourdough, or fresh apple pie. She worked part-time at the local library and liked to talk about making the house a home. And that house, it was perfect. A 2-story, pale blue home with white trim, tucked away on a tree-lined street in a quiet Ohio neighborhood. It had a big porch swing, a freshly mowed lawn, and the kind of wide attic space that made Greg's eyes light up the moment they saw it. Moving in felt like the start of a new chapter, maybe even the happiest one. Family dinners became routine. Greg would tell Laura about small repairs he'd done, tightening loose hinges, oiling squeaky doors. Laura would pull pies from the oven, dusting her hands on her apron. They'd laugh, talk about maybe starting a garden in the spring. And above them, the house was silent. For the first 2 weeks, nothing broke that peace. No odd smells, no drafts, no creaks in the night. But then, it started small, almost gentle. One night, as Greg and Laura were lying in bed, Greg reading, Laura scrolling on her phone, they both paused at the same time. A faint, dry sound drifted from somewhere above their heads. Just a little scrape, a brush of something against wood. Then silence. "Mice," Greg said immediately, setting his book aside. He said it with that casual certainty of a man who had already decided the problem before hearing the evidence. Laura didn't argue. They were in Ohio. Mice happened. It wasn't a big deal. Greg went to the hardware store the next day, came back with a cardboard box under his arm. Snap traps, glue traps, a bag of bait. He set them in the attic that afternoon, dust puffing up in the warm air as he moved boxes and storage bins to make space. Days passed. The traps stayed empty. The scratching continued. At first they heard it maybe once a night, then twice, always faint, always short. The neighbors noticed nothing, or at least that's what Greg thought. But later, when I spoke to one of them, she remembered it differently. Neighbor number 1. I thought I heard something too. You know, late at night. Just this little shuffle. But you figure it's old pipes, you know? Or maybe the house settling. I didn't think nothing of it. I mean, who would? By the 3rd week, the sound changed, the scratching faded, and in its place came something heavier, a sound no mouse could make. The footsteps were deliberate, slow. Greg heard them first one night just after 1 a.m. He froze, his hand tightening on the blanket. Laura whispered, "What is that?" But he didn't answer. They both just listened. The attic was supposed to be empty. Greg got out of bed, pulled on a t-shirt, grabbed the flashlight he kept in the nightstand. Laura stayed where she was, clutching the sheets, her eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling. The ladder to the attic made its own faint groan when Greg pulled it down. He climbed slowly, one hand on the rungs, the other gripping the flashlight. At the top, he pushed his head through the opening and found nothing. Just insulation, cardboard boxes, an old trunk from the previous owners. The beam of the flashlight cut across dust motes swirling in the stale air. The footsteps had stopped. Greg stayed there for a minute, maybe 2, just listening. He could hear Laura's faint breathing downstairs. Beyond that, nothing. He climbed back down, told her it was probably the wood contracting in the cold, told her there was nothing to worry about. But later, he would remember that night differently, and he would admit he hadn't told her everything he saw up there. Chapter 2. The Little Changes. After the footsteps, the house didn't go back to normal. Greg kept checking the attic every few days. Nothing. No droppings, no gnawed wires, no signs of animals. But by the middle of February, Laura noticed something new. It started with a jar of peanut butter. She'd made toast in the morning, took the jar from the cupboard above the counter, used it, put it back in the exact same spot. She was sure of it. That afternoon, when she reached for it again, the jar was on the opposite side of the shelf, turned around so the label faced the wall. She asked Greg if he'd moved it. He shook his head, barely looking up from the sports section. A week later, she found a throw blanket, the one she kept folded at the foot of the couch, wadded up into a ball in the middle of the living room floor. She laughed it off at first. Maybe she'd knocked it down the night before and forgotten. Maybe Greg had pulled it off while watching TV. But then, the coffee mug disappeared. Not just any mug, her favorite one, with the faded blue glaze and tiny chip on the handle. She searched the dishwasher, the cabinets, the sink. It was gone. 3 days later, it was back, sitting on the kitchen counter. Not washed, not where she'd left it. That was the moment Laura decided to start keeping a log. She bought a cheap spiral notebook from the dollar store, wrote house notes on the front in black marker. Every time something moved, she wrote it down. Dates, times, what it was, where it had been before. Later, when I read her entries, the handwriting itself seemed to change over the weeks. It started neat, confident. But as the days passed, the letters got tighter, messier, like her hand was shaking when she wrote. February 12th, peanut butter jar turned around. No one touched it. February 19th, blanket moved from couch to floor. Greg says he didn't do it. February 23rd, mug gone from sink. Found it 3 days later on counter. March 2nd, Hairbrush missing, still missing. March 4th, hallway closet door wide open in the morning. I'm sure I closed it. At first, Greg humored her. He told her it was a good way to keep track. Maybe they were both just being forgetful. Maybe it was some kind of silly new house adjustment phase. But by the second week of the log, they decided to test it. One night, Greg took a screwdriver from his toolbox and placed it in the middle of the kitchen table. He said, and he made sure Laura heard him, "I'm leaving this here. If it's anywhere else in the morning, we've got a problem." The next morning, the screwdriver was gone. Greg found it in the attic, sitting in the middle of the floorboards, surrounded by dust. No footprints, no drag marks, just there. After that, Laura stopped laughing things off. She started feeling it, a presence, not just in the attic, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, even when she was alone in the shower. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of her eye, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, the kind of thing you dismiss before your brain has time to register it. But then came the sensation, that deep, primal certainty of being watched. Standing under the spray of hot water, she would suddenly feel the air shift behind her, like someone was standing on the other side of the curtain. Sometimes she swore she could see the shadow of feet through the milky shower liner, but when she pulled it back, no one, nothing. Neighbor number 2. Laura told me about it once. Real quiet, like she didn't want Greg to hear. She said she kept feeling something. And I told her, it's probably just nerves, new house and all. But she looked me dead in the eye and said, "No, this is different." Greg still wasn't convinced, until the night they both heard it. It was late, almost midnight. They'd been in bed for half an hour, Laura drifting towards sleep, Greg scrolling on his phone. That's when they heard it. Not scratching, not footsteps, breathing. Slow, heavy, rhythmic, coming from above them. Laura sat up instantly, clutching the blanket to her chest. Greg froze, phone still in his hand. They both looked at the ceiling. The breathing didn't stop. It didn't move. It was as though whoever, or whatever, was up there, was just waiting. Greg climbed out of bed. No flashlight this time. He pulled the attic ladder down so fast it slammed against the hallway floor. He climbed 3 rungs and stopped. The breathing had stopped. The attic was silent again, and that silence was worse. For Harper 3, the first camera. After the night of the breathing, Greg decided they needed proof, not just for peace of mind, but so they could show it to someone, a friend, a neighbor, maybe even the police. He drove to the nearest Walmart the next morning and bought a cheap motion-activated camera. Battery-operated, infrared, nothing fancy, just enough to trigger when something moved. That night, after dinner, Greg set it up on a tripod at the end of the hallway. The lens pointed directly at the attic hatch. Laura stood behind him, arms crossed, chewing her lip. "You really think it's gonna catch something?" she asked. Greg just shrugged. "If there's nothing there, we'll know. If there's something, we'll really know." He tried to say it with a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Night 1, nothing. The footage showed the hallway bathed in infrared gray. Every creak, every shadow caused the camera to blink awake, but nothing moved. Night 2, the same. Just empty frames of stillness, occasionally a flicker of dust floating past the lens. Night 3, still nothing. Laura started to relax. She told Greg they were probably just psyching themselves out. But Greg wasn't convinced. And on the 4th night, he was right. The footage started like every other night. Hallway empty, shadows still. The attic hatch in perfect view. 1:17 a.m. The camera was still, silent. 1:18. A faint click. The camera blinked awake. The attic hatch moved, just a little. At first it looked like maybe the wood had shifted. Temperature change. Settling house. But then, it moved again. This time, enough to see the black void above. Slowly, slowly, something pale emerged from that darkness. A hand, thin, bone white, skin pulled tight over knuckles, the nails too long, like yellowed glass. It gripped the edge of the hatch. Then another hand appeared beside it, both pulling, both lowering the hatch with unbearable slowness. And then, a face. First, just the forehead, bald, skin stretched so tight you could trace the shape of the skull beneath. Then the eyes, wide, unblinking, glassy, the kind of stare that feels like it's looking through you instead of at you. It leaned lower. The nose came into frame. Then the mouth, thin lips stretching into something almost like a smile, but wrong. A smile that didn't belong to someone happy. It was the smile of someone enjoying a secret. And then it moved. Not up, not away, but toward the camera. Its head tilted ever so slightly, like it was curious or amused. And then it smiled wider. The kind of smile that shows teeth. The kind of smile you never forget. And then, as if it had gotten bored, it pulled back into the darkness. The hatch lifted, slowly, silently, until it clicked shut. But the worst part? Just before the hatch closed, the thing reached out with one of its pale hands and waved, a small, gentle wave, like it was saying, "I know you're watching." Greg didn't tell Laura about the wave. He told her the camera glitched, showed her the first few seconds of the hatch opening, then pretended the rest was corrupted. But Greg watched it all. Twice. And from that night on, he started locking their bedroom door before they went to sleep. Even though he knew it wouldn't help. Chapter 4. The second camera and the discovery. The footage from the first camera hadn't left Greg's mind. That pale face, those eyes, the slow, deliberate smile before it vanished into the black. He hadn't told Laura about the smile. He didn't need her sleeping even less than she already was. But there was one thing they agreed on. The camera had caught something real. So Greg bought another one. This one was better, higher resolution, infrared, night vision with audio. He set it in the upstairs hallway, aimed directly at the attic hatch. If someone was coming down from there, Greg thought, we'll see them. For 3 nights. Nothing. Just dust drifting in the air, the faint movement of shadows when the wind pushed against the house. On the 4th night, 3:17 a.m., the hatch creaked open. The camera caught it in eerie green night vision. The panel shifted, slow enough that the wood barely made a sound. Then, a hand emerged, thin, pale. The skin stretched tight across the knuckles, the fingers curled over the edge like they were tasting the air. After a moment, a face followed. Gaunt, hair hanging like damp strings, eyes wide and unblinking. It didn't scan the room. It didn't look left or right. It looked directly into the camera lens. And it smiled. Greg didn't watch more. He shut the laptop and called the police. They arrived within 20 minutes. 2 officers, their cruisers painting the quiet street in red and blue. Neighbors peered from behind curtains. A few stepped onto porches. Laura stayed inside, pacing the living room, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Officer Daniels, older, heavy-set, calm, took Greg's statement. Officer Ruiz, younger, eyes sharp and restless, kept scanning the ceiling. "You're sure it wasn't an old video? Or maybe someone you know?" Daniels asked. Greg shook his head. "I don't know them, and they were here last night, in our house." Ruiz tilted his head at the attic hatch. "Let's take a look." The ladder unfolded with a groan, dust falling in thin streams into the light. That smell hit immediately, stale, warm, and faintly sour. It didn't smell like an attic. It smelled like a closed room that someone had been living in, breathing in. Ruiz went first, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Daniels followed, his breathing heavy, picked up by the mic on his vest. From below, Greg heard the crunch of insulation under boots, the slow sweep of light across beams and boxes. "Looks clear," Daniels called down. Greg's voice was sharp. "Check the far corner, under the insulation, behind the beam." There was a pause, then the sound of insulation being pulled aside. They found it, a small cleared space hidden under the insulation. In it, a thin, stained mattress, the kind you'd find abandoned on a sidewalk. Next to it, a small pile of clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, socks, all worn down, oily with old sweat. Food wrappers, fast food bags, a half-empty bottle of water, and photographs. Dozens of them. Greg and Laura's wedding photographs, not scattered, not tossed aside, but arranged neatly in a perfect square. Faces smiling, hands intertwined. A day frozen in sunlight, now lying in the dust of a dark attic. Ruiz picked one up. On the back, written in thick black marker, was a single word: "Mine." Greg felt his throat tighten. Daniel said nothing, just kept scanning the darkness beyond the beam of his flashlight. The air was heavy, oppressive, and warm. Warm, like someone had just been there, breathing. They never found anyone that night, but as Greg looked at the photographs laid out on the attic floor, he realized something. Whoever it was. They'd been there long enough to know everything about him and Laura, and they were still there, somewhere. Chapter 5. The History of the House. After the police left, Greg didn't sleep. Laura sat curled on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the floor like she was trying to see through it into the attic above. Greg sat at the dining table with his laptop, the dim glow lighting his face. He typed in the house's address. At first, it was nothing. Property tax records, a few blurry photos from the real estate listing. But then, an article, an old, grainy scan of a local newspaper from the late 1970s. The headline read, "Elderly man found dead in his home. Cause of death unknown." The article described him. Name, Walter Hensley. Age, 74. Cause of death, pending investigation. But the article was vague. No autopsy details, no family interviews, just a few quotes from neighbors, and one detail that caught Greg's attention. Residents claim to have seen movement in the upstairs windows for days after Mr. Hensley's passing. Movement. In a house that should have been empty. Greg scrolled deeper. Another article appeared, older this time. This one wasn't about Hensley. It was about the house itself, built in 1922, owned by only 3 families in over a century, and every one of those families had left, abruptly. No recorded sales negotiations, no goodbyes in the community, just gone. Greg's curiosity turned to obsession. He dug through local archives, pulling up any mention of the address. A real estate blurb from 1948 praising its expansive attic storage space. A 1963 classified ad hastily posted by a widow selling the home for well below market value. And then a story from 1985. The headline was small, buried in the back pages. Unidentified figure spotted in vacant home. A neighbor claimed they saw a tall figure, thin as a rail, standing in the second-floor window. It stood there for almost an hour, never moved, never blinked, just watched. The deeper Greg went, the stranger it became. A 2003 neighborhood forum thread, long abandoned, where someone posted, "Avoid the house on Ridgeway. I saw something in the attic. It's not empty." No one replied. The account was deleted the next day. Greg decided to speak to someone who might know more. At the local library, he met Margaret Alden, the town's unofficial historian. She was in her late 60s, with sharp eyes that didn't soften when she smiled. Her office was a maze of file boxes, yellowed photographs, and shelves lined with history books. Greg told her the address. Her expression changed instantly. She closed the folder she'd been working on and leaned back in her chair. "That house has had visitors," she said. "It's not the first time someone's been found living in attics around here, but this one's different." Greg asked her what she meant. She leaned forward again, lowering her voice like the walls could hear. "This one watched." Margaret rifled through a drawer and pulled out a worn manila envelope. Inside were black and white photographs, blurry, taken from the street looking up at the house. In one, you could make out a pale oval shape in the attic window. Not a face exactly, but close. In another, the shape was gone, replaced by the shadow of something tall standing just out of sight. Margaret slid the photos back into the envelope and pushed it across the desk toward Greg. "You can keep them," she said. "But I wouldn't stay there another night." Greg left the library with the photos tucked under his arm. Outside, the air felt heavier. The light seemed dimmer. And as he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone was watching him, just like they always had. Chapter 6. The Breathing Call. The morning after they moved out, Laura tried to convince herself that the weight pressing down on her chest was just exhaustion. The movers had been late. The boxes had piled up in the new apartment. Neither she nor Greg had slept much in weeks. But when she saw the red voicemail notification on her phone, her stomach tightened. The number was blocked. She pressed play. At first, nothing. Then, breathing. Slow, steady. Inhale. Exhale. It wasn't the rushed, uneven kind of breathing you hear from a prank caller. This was patient, deliberate. Whoever it was, wasn't trying to scare her. They were listening. A sound layered beneath the breathing made Laura's blood run cold. It was subtle, like something in the distance. But she knew it instantly. The creak. That same long, aching groan the floorboard outside their old bedroom used to make. The one Greg always stepped on in the middle of the night when he went to check the attic hatch. But they weren't in that house anymore. That house was empty. Laura deleted the message, told herself it was a wrong number, but the next day, there was another one. Same blocked number, same slow breathing, same floorboard creak. This time, the breathing was deeper, heavier, like whoever was on the other end was closer to the phone. She could hear moisture in each exhale, almost like the caller's mouth was open, just enough for air to drag across their teeth. She didn't tell Greg, not yet, but she kept the message, played it again that night while Greg was in the shower, and in the background, barely there but unmistakable, she heard something new. A shuffle, like someone was dragging their foot across carpet. The third day, she woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Another voicemail. She hesitated before pressing play. The breathing began again, slow, steady, unnervingly calm. The creak came next, then the shuffle, and then something else. A faint, raspy whisper, the voice so dry it sounded as though the speaker's throat was made of dust. "I miss the attic." The words weren't rushed. They were longing, like a lover speaking to someone they hadn't seen in years. Laura's thumb hovered over the delete button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Instead, she put the phone down and walked into the kitchen, her hands shaking. She didn't notice until much later that night that the call had been made at 3:17 a.m., the same time Greg had first seen the attic hatch begin to move. Chapter 7. The second sighting. 2 months passed. Greg and Laura tried to fold themselves into the rhythm of a normal life again. The apartment was small, but the walls were thin enough to hear their neighbors' TV shows, the arguments, the occasional burst of laughter. That sound of other people was comforting. But the nightmares came anyway. For Laura, it was always the attic. For Greg, it was the face, the pale, gaunt thing staring into his camera lens. He would wake with the feeling that someone had just stepped back from the edge of their bed. It was on a Wednesday morning when the phone rang. The number was from the Ridgeway Police Department. The officer's tone was polite, but laced with that subtle, careful tension used when trying not to alarm someone. The new owners of Greg and Laura's old home had called in a report. Footsteps. At night. And not the random settling of an old house, but pacing. Over and over. Back and forth. In the attic. The officer explained that the family had woken to find their pantry door open. Several food items were missing. Bread, peanut butter, a jar of pickles, half a pack of crackers. The back door had been locked, all windows secured. Yet the dog, normally quick to bark at anything, hadn't made a sound. Just lay curled in the living room, trembling. Greg's stomach tightened as the officer continued. They were asking him and Laura to come in for a statement. Anything they remembered from their time in the house could be useful. Maybe it was a squatter, they said. Maybe someone who'd been living there all along had returned. But Greg already knew the truth before he hung up the phone. It wasn't a maybe. It was the same presence. The same one that had whispered to Laura, "I miss the attic." When he told Laura about the call, she froze mid-step in the kitchen. Her hand hovered above the sink, a plate still dripping water. She didn't look at him, didn't speak for several seconds. Then she shook her head and said quietly, "I'm not going back." Greg didn't argue, because he wasn't going back either. Still, that night, Greg couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every sound, every creak from that house, wondering if right at that moment, someone was standing in that attic again, head tilted, listening. The thought clung to him until 3:17 a.m. That cursed time burned into his memory, and in the stillness of their apartment, he swore he could hear it. Not in his memory, but in the present. A faint sound, somewhere far above them. 2 months, new owners, new life, but the sound had followed. Chapter 8. Theories. Greg sat at the small kitchen table of their apartment, his laptop open but untouched. The police report from the new owners of their old house was still fresh in his mind. Pantry door, missing food, footsteps in the attic, the same pattern. Again. He couldn't stop thinking about it. If it was just a homeless man, Why hadn't they caught him? The attic had one way in, the hatch in the hallway ceiling, no secret stairwell, no hidden door, and yet, whoever or whatever it was had been there, quiet, patient, unseen. Greg opened a blank document and typed out the first word: possibilities. 1. Homeless man using attic for shelter. That was the police's preferred explanation. Simple, logical, but Greg knew the attic. It wasn't easy to live up there. No insulation worth anything. Cold in winter, unbearable in summer. And yet, when they found that mattress months ago, the attic had been warm. Not dusty warm, like air trapped by heat, but freshly warm, like body heat. 2. Someone else. Someone who wasn't homeless. Someone who had an attachment to the house. Someone who watched, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. That thought chilled him more than the first. Because in that scenario, it wasn't about survival. It was about pleasure. He took a sip of coffee, the mug rattling slightly against the table, and typed the third line: 3. Something else entirely. He stared at the words for a long time. The camera footage replayed in his mind. The pale hand, the gaunt face, the way it had stared directly into the lens and smiled. That smile wasn't desperate. It wasn't humanly afraid of being caught. It was knowing. That smile belonged to something that didn't fear them. Something that had no reason to. Laura sat on the couch across from him, flipping through an old book, pretending to read, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted up whenever he shifted in his chair. Finally, she said it. Greg, you know it's not a man, right? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both remembered the insulation they had peeled back in the attic, the neat arrangement of their wedding photos, the food wrappers, all things a human could do, but also things something could mimic. Greg typed the last note. A man can leave footprints. He hesitated before adding the next part. This didn't. The more they thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. The pantry food might have been taken, but no one had ever seen crumbs, wrappers left out, or half-eaten items. Everything was just gone, like it had never existed in the first place. And there was one other thing Greg hadn't told Laura, something he'd noticed that last night before they moved out. In the thin layer of dust on the attic floor, there had been a path, not from the hatch to the mattress, but in a perfect circle, over and over, worn smooth, as though something had been pacing for hours in the dark. Greg closed the laptop without saving the file. He didn't want the words staring back at him, because writing them down made them real, and if they were real, then whatever had lived above their heads for months might not be done with them yet. Chapter 9. The unsolved ending. Weeks turned into months. The police reports stopped arriving in Greg's inbox. The case, as far as the authorities were concerned, was cold. No arrest, no identity, no trail to follow. Officially, they called it an open investigation. Unofficially, they'd stopped looking. In the files, the intruder was just unknown male, but Greg had stopped thinking of him as human long ago. There were too many things that didn't add up. The silent movements, the way the attic air had always felt, recently used, and the absence of any footprints in thick layers of dust. Someone like that, if it was a someone, should have slipped up eventually, left something behind. But it was as if the intruder could vanish between breaths. Months after they left Ridgeway, Greg stumbled across an online forum dedicated to urban legends in Ohio. Thread after thread told the same kind of story. Families hearing movement in the walls at night, food going missing from kitchens, children saying they saw a pale face peering from the attic hatch. And the strangest part? The towns were different, the houses were different. But the description was always the same. Tall, thin, and smiling. Some users claimed it was a drifter, a man who'd learned to slip in and out of homes without being seen, living above families for weeks before moving on. Others swore it wasn't a man at all, but something older, something that didn't need to eat, but took food just to convince you it was human. A mimic, an echo of a person who once lived and couldn't leave. One post in particular stayed with Greg. A woman from a small town outside Cleveland wrote, "I never saw him, but my dog did. Every night around 3 a.m., she'd stand under the ceiling hatch and growl. Then, one night, she stopped. We found her the next morning in the yard. The hatch was open." Rumors spread that the intruder still lived somewhere in Ohio, that he moved from attic to attic, picking houses that wouldn't notice the faint sounds overhead. He was never caught because maybe he didn't want to be caught. Maybe he was looking for the right house to stay in, permanently. Greg deleted the forum from his bookmarks. He never told Laura he'd read it. But every night, as they lay in bed in their new apartment, he found his eyes drifting upward, toward the ceiling, listening, just in case. Check your ceiling tonight. And remember, you might not be alone. Outro. You've just spent some minutes inside this nightmare. You've walked through the attic. You've heard the breathing. You've seen the smile. But now I have to ask you something. How well do you really know your home? Maybe you think you do. You've lived there for years. You know every corner, every door, every window, or at least, you think you do. But attics have a way of keeping secrets. They hold the things you forget, and sometimes, the things you never knew were there. If you're new here, subscribe to Screams of the Mind every single day. I'll bring you deeper into the places you try to avoid, the rooms you keep locked, the hallways you don't walk down after dark, the thoughts you try to push away before you sleep. I'll pull you into them, and I won't let you go. And if you think you're safe because you've checked your attic, because you've looked once, maybe twice, and found nothing, let me tell you something. Looking once isn't enough. Looking twice isn't enough. Because the moment you stop checking, that's when something decides to move in. Tonight, after this video ends, I want you to go to your attic hatch. Don't rush. Stand under it, in the dark, and listen. Count the seconds between your own breaths. And if you hear another breath in between yours, don't open the hatch, just leave. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard movement in your attic? A creak, a shift, a sound you told yourself was the house settling? Because if you have, you might not be the first person to hear it, and you won't be the last. Look again, slowly, and remember, you might not be alone.